On a bitter Christmas day in 1642, in the small stone-built manor of Woolsthorpe, Lincolnshire, a child was born so small that his family feared he would not survive the night. England was falling apart, plunged into the opening months of the bloody English Civil War, and the Newton household was already in mourning. 3 months prior, Isaac Newton's father, an uneducated but prosperous yeoman farmer, also named Isaac, had died. The infant inherited his father's name, his estate, and a grim prognosis. His mother, Hannah Ayscough, later recalled that the baby was small enough to fit inside a tiny wooden quart mug, and so frail that 2 women sent to fetch medicine in the nearby town of Grantham did not expect him to still be breathing when they returned. Yet Isaac survived. For the first 3 years of his life, he was the center of his mother's world. But in 1645, a prosperous 60-year-old Anglican minister named Barnabas Smith offered Hannah a marriage proposal with one devastating condition. Smith wanted a wife, but he did not want another man's toddler. Hannah accepted the proposal and moved to the nearby village of North Witham, leaving 3-year-old Isaac behind at Woolsthorpe Manor to be raised by his maternal grandmother, Marjorie Ayscough. This traumatic separation fundamentally warped Newton's personality. While other children in the Lincolnshire countryside played or labored in the fields, Isaac retreated into intense, brooding isolation. He regarded his grandmother with cold detachment and developed a fierce, lifelong hatred for his stepfather. Years later, as a young student at Cambridge, Newton recorded a private list of his past sins in a personal notebook written in secret shorthand. Among mundane youth transgressions were dark, violent confessions, threatening my father and mother Smith to burn them and the house over them, and wishing death and saying so to some. Without playmates, young Newton turned his energy toward the physical world around him. He showed little interest in farm work or livestock, but possessed a remarkable talent for manual craftsmanship. Using a small set of hand tools given to him by his uncle, he filled the manor house with intricate mechanical models. When a new windmill was erected near Grantham, Isaac spent hours inspecting its gears, eventually building an exact working replica out of wood and cloth. To make his model turn even when the wind dropped, he placed a small mouse inside a treadmill wheel, which he dubbed the Miller. He carved elaborate sundials into the stone walls of Woolsthorpe Manor, measured the shadows of trees to track the passage of time, and constructed paper lanterns that he attached to the tails of kites at night, frightening his neighbors into believing they were seeing mysterious comets in the night sky. At age 12, Newton was sent to King's School in Grantham, boarding at the home of Mr. Clark, a local apothecary. The apothecary's house proved to be a sanctuary. Isaac surrounded himself with jars of chemicals, herbs, and old medical books, beginning his lifelong fascination with chemical mixing and experimentation. At first, Isaac was an unremarkable, distracted student who ranked near the bottom of his class. That changed after a fight in the churchyard with a school bully. According to local accounts, Newton fought the boy, beat him, and rubbed his face against the church wall. Unsatisfied with merely physical victory, Isaac determined to surpass his rival academically, rapidly rising to become the top student at King's School. In 1659, following the death of his stepfather, his mother Hannah returned to Woolsthorpe and pulled 16-year-old Isaac out of school. She expected her eldest son to manage the family estate, oversee farm hands, and sell grain at the market. It was a total disaster. Newton neglected the crops, allowed the sheep to stray into neighbors' fields, and spent his market days sitting under hedges in Grantham, reading books he had borrowed from Mr. Clark, the family's farm servants. Openly complained that young Isaac was useless. Seeing his nephew's total incompetence as a farmer and his obvious intellect, Isaac's uncle, William Ayscough, a graduate of Cambridge, persuaded Hannah to send the boy back to school to prepare for university. The headmaster at Grantham even agreed to waive Isaac's tuition fees. In June 1661, 18-year-old Isaac Newton rode out of Lincolnshire toward the medieval towers of Cambridge. He entered Trinity College as a sizar, the lowest social rank for a student. Because his mother, despite her wealth, refused to spend more than a minimal sum on his education, Isaac was required to act as a valet for wealthier students and fellows. He carried their meals from the kitchens, emptied their chamber pots, brushed their clothes, and ran errands in exchange for free tuition and discounted meals. The formal curriculum at 17th century Cambridge was rigid and archaic, almost entirely dominated by the ancient Greek logic and natural philosophy of Aristotle. Students spent their days translating Latin texts and debating medieval theology. Newton, however, quietly rebelled. In 1664, he set up a private notebook which he titled in Latin, Questiones Quaedam Philosophicae, certain philosophical questions. On the very first page, he penned a bold personal motto, Amicus Plato, amicus Aristoteles, magis amica veritas. Plato is my friend, Aristotle is my friend, but my greatest friend is truth. In secret, Newton consumed the forbidden modern writings of European revolutionaries, René Descartes' mechanical philosophy, Johannes Kepler's planetary math, and Galileo Galilei's physics of motion. He worked with an obsessive, self-destructive intensity, often remaining awake until 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning, ignoring meals entirely. He filled page after page with original mathematical formulations, developing his own method of measuring smooth curves and changing quantities, the early roots of what would become calculus. By the early months of 1665, Newton had earned his Bachelor of Arts degree, quietly graduating without any special academic honors or public recognition. He was 22 years old, entirely unknown to the world, and preparing to spend his life as a quiet, solitary scholar at Cambridge. Then the plague arrived. In the hot, dry summer of 1665, a terrible shadow fell over England. Bubonic plague, carried by flea-infested rats, exploded across the crowded streets of London. The infection spread like wildfire through the country, claiming thousands of lives every week. Panic gripped the universities. In June 1665, Cambridge College officials shuttered Trinity College, dismissed the students, and ordered everyone to flee into the countryside. 22-year-old Isaac Newton packed his books, papers, and small collection of glass prisms, returning north to his mother's quiet farm at Woolsthorpe Manor. For the next 18 months, with short interruptions when the university briefly reopened, Newton lived in near total isolation. Cut off from professors, academic rivalries, and the social distractions of college life, his hyper-focused mind turned inward. What followed is widely regarded as the most extraordinary burst of individual intellectual productivity in the history of human science, his Annus Mirabilis, or Year of Wonders. While sitting at his small wooden desk in his upstairs bedroom, Newton confronted a fundamental limitation in European mathematics. Mathematicians of the era could easily calculate the area of flat, rigid geometric shapes like squares and triangles. But they lacked the mathematical tools to calculate continuous change, such as the changing speed of a falling rock, the curving motion of a planet, or the exact slope of a curve at a single instantaneous moment. To solve this, Newton created a brand new mathematical framework. He termed it the method of fluxions, what we know today as differential and integral calculus. He treated motion not as a series of static snapshots, but as a continuous flow. He invented mathematical symbols to represent infinitesimally small quantities of time and space, allowing him to track rate of change with absolute mathematical precision. In a matter of months, a 23-year-old farm boy had bypassed 2,000 years of classical Greek geometry and single-handedly constructed the primary language of modern science and engineering. Yet true to his secretive nature, Newton wrote down his discoveries in private papers and shared them with almost no one. He felt no urgent need to publish his work, preferring to keep his mathematical secrets strictly to himself. When he was not filling pages with mathematical symbols, Newton turned his bedroom into an optical laboratory. At the time, natural philosophers believed, following ancient doctrines, that pure sunlight was intrinsically white, and that colors were merely dirty corruptions introduced when light interacted with solid matter, like dark clouds or stained glass. Newton was deeply skeptical. He bought a small, triangular glass prism at a local fair, shuttered his bedroom windows, and cut a single tiny hole in a wooden shutter to allow a thin beam of sunlight to slice through the darkness. He pointed the beam of light directly through the glass prism. Instead of merely magnifying or altering the light, the prism bent the sunbeam, projecting a rich, brilliant spectrum of rainbow colors across the far wall: red, yellow, green, blue, and violet. To prove that the prism was not creating the colors itself, Newton performed a masterstroke of experimental design. He passed the rainbow of colors through a second inverted prism. The second prism gathered the dispersed colors and recombined them back into a single beam of pure white light. Newton had proven something revolutionary. White light was not pure or elemental. It was a complex composite made up of all the colors of the rainbow, each bending at a slightly different angle when passing through glass. His obsession with vision drove him to dangerous physical extremes. To understand how the human eye perceives light and pressure, Newton took a blunt bodkin, a long, dull sewing needle, and forced it between his eye socket and the bone, pressing against the back of his eyeball until he saw distorted circles of color. He recorded the painful experiment calmly in his journal, unconcerned that he had nearly blinded himself. It was during this period of rural seclusion that the most famous legend in the history of science took place. According to Newton's own account in his later years, he was sitting in the orchard at Woolsthorpe Manor, watching the leaves fall in the autumn breeze, when he saw an apple drop straight down from a tree to the ground. The phenomenon was so ordinary that no one else gave it a second thought. But Newton asked himself a radical question. Why did the apple always fall perpendicular to the earth? Why didn't it fall sideways? Why didn't it float upward? He reasoned that there must be an invisible drawing power in matter, a pull concentrated at the center of the earth. And then came his true leap of genius. If this gravitational pull could reach to the top of an apple tree, could it reach even higher? Could it reach all the way to the top of the highest mountains? Could it reach all the way to the moon? Newton realized that if the Earth's gravity pulled on the moon, it would pull the moon out of a straight path, bending its trajectory into a continuous circular orbit around the Earth, just like a stone swung around on a string. He immediately began drafting calculations, attempting to compare the force required to keep the moon in orbit with the force that pulled the apple to the ground. His initial calculations were slightly off due to inaccurate measurements of the Earth's radius available at the time, leading him to set the problem aside temporarily. But the conceptual seed had been planted. The same physical force that governed earthly objects ruled the motion of the heavens. By the spring of 1667, the Great Plague had subsided, and Trinity College reopened its gates. Newton returned to Cambridge as a changed man. In less than 2 years of quiet farm isolation, he had invented calculus, discovered the true nature of light and color, and conceived the theory of universal gravitation. Yet, he had published not a single word of it. To the outside world, Isaac Newton was still just a quiet, intense master student returning to his university duties. That anonymity would not last much longer. In October 1669, Isaac Barrow, Newton's mentor and the prestigious Lucasian professor of mathematics at Cambridge, made a breathtaking decision. Recognizing that his young student's mathematical insights far surpassed his own, Barrow resigned from his chair and actively lobbied to have 26-year-old Isaac Newton appointed in his place. Suddenly, Newton was elevated to one of the most elite academic positions in Europe. The Lucasian professorship came with a generous salary and a rare privilege. Newton was not required to teach heavy undergraduate courses unless students specifically requested them. He was free to retreat into his stone-walled chambers at Trinity College and pursue his private obsessions without distraction. Yet, true to form, Newton did not choose to lecture on calculus or the groundbreaking optical experiments he had performed during the plague years. Instead, his first official lectures at Cambridge were dedicated to a subject most academics considered archaic: optics. Since Galileo had pointed his primitive spyglass toward the night sky 60 years earlier, astronomers had struggled with a frustrating physical flaw known as chromatic aberration. Refracting telescopes used glass lenses to bend starlight and focus it into an eyepiece. But as Newton had proven in his dark bedroom with his prisms, glass acted like a prism, bending different colors of light at different angles. This caused fuzzy, rainbow-colored halos to blur around stars and planets, severely limiting the magnification and clarity of early telescopes. Newton realized that if lenses broke white light into a rainbow, he had to eliminate lenses entirely. Using his exceptional manual skills, Newton abandoned glass lenses and designed a brand new type of instrument, the reflecting telescope. Instead of forcing starlight to a glass lens at the front of the tube, Newton placed a highly polished, curved metallic mirror at the base of a short copper tube. The mirror captured incoming starlight and reflected it forward to a tiny diagonal mirror, bouncing the image cleanly out the side of the tube into a small eyepiece. The device was revolutionary. Though it was only 6 inches long, Newton's tiny reflector had the magnifying power of a massive, unwieldy, 6-foot refracting telescope, completely free of color distortion. Word of Newton's miraculous little telescope reached the Royal Society of London, the premier scientific institution in the British Empire, packed with elite minds like Christopher Wren, Robert Boyle, and a brilliant, sharp-tongued polymath named Robert Hooke. In December 1671, Newton shipped his handmade telescope down to London. The society was mesmerized. They invited Newton to become a fellow, praising him as a genius of the highest order. For an ordinary man, this public validation would have been a triumph. For Isaac Newton, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Hitherto accustomed to total isolation, Newton loathed public scrutiny. When his telescope was presented, fellow scientists immediately began picking apart minor details, asking technical questions, and suggesting alternative designs. Worse still, Robert Hooke, who was the Royal Society's curator of experiments and considered himself England's leading authority on optics, critiqued Newton's theories on light. Hooke believed light was a pressure wave. Newton insisted it was composed of tiny physical particles, corpuscles. Instead of treating the scientific debate as a normal academic exchange, Newton took it as a deeply personal betrayal. Furious, hypersensitive, and utterly unable to handle criticism, Newton flew into a rage. He threatened to sever all ties with the Royal Society, vowed never to publish another word on science, and retreated back into his Cambridge fortress, slamming the door on the intellectual world for over a decade. During the 1670s, while Europe buzzed with rumors about the reclusive professor at Cambridge, Newton spent his time diving into forbidden rabbit holes. He corresponded reluctantly with a few trusted minds, such as the Dutch physicist Christiaan Huygens and philosopher John Locke, but he largely avoided public scientific discourse. Behind his locked study doors, Newton poured his energy into 2 secret parallel passions that he guarded with absolute paranoia. 1. Alchemy. He built a brick-smelting furnace in his garden at Trinity College, purchasing hundreds of chemical books and spending weeks melting mercury, lead, antimony, and copper in crucibles, searching for the ancient secrets of transmutation. 2. Heresy. Using his formidable intellect to study biblical manuscripts in original Greek and Hebrew, Newton concluded that the doctrine of the Trinity, the foundational Christian dogma of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as one God, was a fraudulent theological corruption introduced centuries after Christ. To voice these beliefs publicly in 17th century England meant immediate expulsion, social ruin, or imprisonment for blasphemy. So Newton kept his mouth shut, writing millions of words of secret theological manuscripts that would remain hidden for centuries after his death. By 1684, Isaac Newton was comfortably invisible, lost in his private world of alchemy and ancient texts. He had effectively retired from active physics at age 40. He had no idea that a wealthy young astronomer in London was about to mount a horse, ride north toward Cambridge, and drag him kicking and screaming into immortality. In August 1684, a 38-year-old London astronomer named Edmund Halley arrived at Trinity College, Cambridge. Halley was facing a dilemma that had baffled the finest minds of Europe. During a meeting at a coffee house in London, Halley, along with the architect Sir Christopher Wren and the quarrelsome Robert Hooke, had debated the laws of planetary motion. Johannes Kepler had long established that planets orbited the sun in ellipses, not perfect circles. But why? Hooke claimed he had solved the mathematical proof, showing that an inverse square law of gravity, where gravitational pull weakens by the square of the distance, would force a planet into an elliptical orbit. However, Hooke refused to produce the math, keeping it hidden to taunt his colleagues. Frustrated, Halley traveled to Cambridge to seek out the quiet Lucasian professor. Entering Newton's dimly lit chambers, Halley asked him directly, "What path do you believe the planets would follow, assuming the force of attraction toward the sun varies inversely as the square of the distance from it?" Newton did not hesitate for a second. He answered instantly, "An ellipse." Stunned, Halley asked him how he could possibly know that with such certainty. "Why," Newton replied offhandedly, "I have calculated it." When Halley eagerly demanded to see the mathematical proof, Newton rummaged through a chaotic mess of papers on his desk, claimed he had mislaid it, and promised to recreate the math and send it to Halley in London. 18 months of madness. Newton had indeed worked out the math years earlier during the plague at Woolsthorpe, but he had filed it away and forgotten it. When he sat down to reconstruct the proof for Halley, he realized that his original calculations contained minor errors. The challenge reawakened something ferocious inside Newton's mind. His obsession with alchemy and ancient theology evaporated, replaced by an absolute, terrifying intellectual focus. What began as a simple 9-page paper titled De Motu Corporum Ingerum, on the motion of bodies in an orbit, quickly ballooned into a monumental treatise. For 18 months, between 1684 and 1686, Newton entered a state of near madness. He rarely left his room. He forgot to eat his meals, leaving trays of cold food untouched outside his door for days. His assistant later recorded that Newton frequently slept for only 2 or 3 hours a night, occasionally rising from his bed to sit on the edge of his mattress for hours in a trance, staring blankly into space while working through mathematical steps in his head. When he did walk across the college courtyard, he moved briskly with his head down, taking sudden turns to dash back to his desk before a thought escaped him. Newton was putting together the total physical blueprint of the cosmos. By 1686, the manuscript was complete. Titled Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, it was written entirely in dense, rigorous Latin. It was a masterpiece, but it almost never saw the light of day. When the manuscript was presented to the Royal Society, Robert Hooke immediately launched an aggressive campaign, claiming that Newton had stolen the idea of the inverse square law from him. Newton was so deeply offended by the accusation that he flew into a rage, tore up his draft of the 3rd volume, and threatened to cancel the book entirely. It took all of Edmund Halley's diplomatic skill to calm Newton down, assuring him that his work was entirely original and begging him to complete the text. Then came a financial catastrophe. The Royal Society had recently emptied its coffers, publishing a massive, expensive illustrated book titled The History of Fishes, which had flopped catastrophically, leaving the Society bankrupt. They informed Halley that while they approved Newton's book, they could not afford to print it. Determined not to let the greatest scientific manuscript in history go unpublished, Edmund Halley paid for the entire printing cost out of his own pocket, even taking his salary from the Royal Society in unsold copies of the History of Fishes. In July 1687, the Principia was finally published. It changed human thought forever. In the book's opening sections, Newton established the fundamental axioms of physical reality, defining concepts that had eluded humanity for centuries: mass, force, momentum, space, and time. He laid down his world-changing 3 laws of motion. 1. The law of inertia. Every object continues in its state of rest, or of uniform motion in a straight line, unless it is compelled to change that state by forces impressed upon it. 2. The fundamental law of dynamics, F equals ma. The change of motion is proportional to the motive force impressed, and takes place in the direction of the straight line in which that force is impressed. 3. The law of action and reaction. To every action, there is always opposed an equal reaction. Building upon these 3 simple laws, Newton introduced the law of universal gravitation. Every particle of matter in the universe attracts every other particle with a force directly, proportional to the product of their masses, and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between their centers. With a single mathematical equation, Newton erased the 2,000-year-old boundary between Earth and space. The force that caused a stone to drop in London was the exact same force that guided the tides of the ocean, kept the moon bound to Earth, and locked Jupiter's moons in their cosmic dance around their parent planet. The Principia was not an easy read. Newton deliberately made the mathematics extraordinarily difficult, using complex classical geometry rather than his own calculus, to prevent what he called mathematical smatterers from criticizing his work. Few people could read the text from cover to cover, but those who could, men like Huygens, Halley, and John Locke, understood immediately that the world had fundamentally shifted. At 44 years old, Isaac Newton had achieved what no human being had ever done before. He had replaced a universe of mystery, luck, and divine whim with an orderly, predictable, and mathematically perfect clockwork universe. He had become the undisputed king of European intellect. But the intense mental strain of creating the Principia had pushed Newton to the absolute edge of sanity, and the darkness was about to close in. Following the triumphant publication of the Principia, Newton was pulled out of his academic isolation and thrust onto the political stage. In 1688, England was rocked by the Glorious Revolution. The Catholic King James II was deposed, and the Protestant monarchs William of Orange and Mary II took the throne. When King James had attempted to force Cambridge University to admit a Catholic monk without requiring him to take the traditional Anglican oaths, Newton, a fierce defender of the university's independence, had stood up in protest against the crown. Recognizing his standing, Cambridge elected Newton as its Member of Parliament in 1689. He spent a year in London attending parliamentary sessions. Characteristically, Newton was far from an outspoken politician. Records indicate that during his entire time in the House of Commons, he spoke only once to ask an usher to close a window because there was a draft. Yet, his time in London changed him. For the first time in his life, Newton mixed with high society, politicians, and leading philosophers. He formed a close, affectionate friendship with a brilliant young Swiss mathematician named Nicolas Faycio de Dulier. Faycio became perhaps the only person to ever breach Newton's defensive shell, becoming his confidant and protégé. By 1693, Newton's world was crumbling around him. His intense friendship with Faycio de Dulier dissolved abruptly following an unknown dispute. Breaking Newton's heart, and leaving him utterly isolated once again. At the same time, years of sleep deprivation, intense mental overwork, and toxic exposure to heavy metals in his alchemy laboratory caught up with him. Modern tests on locks of Newton's preserved hair revealed elevated levels of mercury, lead, and arsenic, chemical elements he had routinely tasted and inhaled during his furnace experiments. In the autumn of 1693, 50-year-old Isaac Newton suffered a severe mental breakdown. He experienced intense paranoia, insomnia, and erratic behavior. He sent wild, accusatory letters to his few friends in London. He wrote to the philosopher John Locke, accusing Locke of trying to embroil me with women and wishing that Locke were dead. He wrote to Samuel Pepys, claiming he could no longer see his friends or eat his food, and accusing Pepys of trying to drag him into unwanted political favors. Alarmed, his friends recognized that the great intellect was temporarily out of his mind. Locke and Pepys responded with patience and gentle compassion, assuring Newton of their friendship. By early 1694, the psychotic episode passed, and Newton regained his composure. But he had grown weary of Cambridge, exhausted by physics, and deeply eager to abandon his solitary academic life for a prestigious government post in London. 3. The Secret Furnace, Deciphering Alchemy. While Newton waited for a political appointment, he threw himself back into his furnace laboratory at Trinity College. To the modern world, alchemy is viewed as a primitive, fraudulent superstition. But to Newton, alchemy, or chemistry, as he called it, was a noble, highly disciplined search for the hidden, active principles that held matter together. He believed that God had embedded fundamental secrets about the universe into chemical structures, secrets that ancient civilizations had once understood, but lost over time. In total secrecy, Newton wrote over 1 million words on alchemy. He created complex shorthand ciphers, disguised his formulas in symbolic allegories, and spent thousands of hours trying to synthesize the philosopher's stone, a mythical substance capable of turning base metals into silver or gold and revealing the living force of nature. He corresponded with a tight network of secret alchemists across Europe under the pseudonym Jevisanctus Unus, an anagram of his Latinized name, Isaacus Newtonus, which translated to One Holy Jehovah. Equally secretive was Newton's theological work. Newton was not a conventional Christian. He was a passionate, radical biblical scholar who treated ancient scripture with the same rigorous logic he applied to gravity. After analyzing thousands of early Greek, Hebrew, and Latin religious texts, Newton became convinced that the doctrine of the Trinity was an unholy heresy. He argued that early church leaders in the 4th century had corrupted the true message of the Bible to gain political power, falsely elevating Jesus Christ to equal status with God the Father. To Newton, there was only one supreme God, God the Father. Worshipping Jesus as God was, in Newton's eyes, a form of idolatry that doomed the soul to damnation. Had Newton's secret religious writings been discovered during his lifetime, he would have been stripped of his professorship at Cambridge, cast out of society, and potentially imprisoned for heresy under English law. To protect himself, Newton hid his theological manuscripts in locked trunks. They remained hidden for over 2 centuries, only coming to light in 1936 when they were auctioned off at Sotheby's and purchased by the economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynes famously remarked, after reading Newton's secret papers, "Newton was not the first of the age of reason. He was the last of the magicians." By 1696, Newton had spent 35 years within the quiet stone walls of Cambridge. He was 53 years old, mentally drained from his scientific masterworks and tired of academic life. In March 1696, an official letter arrived from London. His influential friend, Charles Montague, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, had secured him an appointment as the Warden of the Royal Mint. Newton packed up his books, closed the door to his chambers at Trinity College, and turned his back on Cambridge forever. He was moving to London, not to write more physics, but to run the economy of England and wage a brutal war against criminals. When 53-year-old Isaac Newton arrived in London in April 1696 to assume the office of Warden of the Royal Mint, he was expected to take up a cushy, high-paying sinecure, a reward for his intellectual service to the nation that required little real labor. Instead, Newton walked directly into a national economic catastrophe. England's financial system was on the verge of total collapse. The nation's currency consisted of hand-hammered silver coins, easily shaved around the edges by criminals who melted down the stolen slivers for pure silver metal. Decades of this clipping had left the circulating currency mutilated, degraded, and worth less than half its face value. At the same time, criminal syndicates were flooding the country with sophisticated counterfeit coins. Overseas trade was grinding to a halt. Riots were breaking out in English towns, and the government was struggling to finance its costly wars against France. To save the economy, Parliament ordered the Great Recoinage. Every silver coin in England had to be called in, melted down, and reminted with machine-milled, reeded edges that made clipping impossible. While previous wardens had treated the job as a ceremonial title, Newton threw himself into the mint with the same terrifying, hyper-focused intensity he had brought to calculus and optics. He moved his office directly into the Tower of London, where the mint was housed among armor, cannons, and political prisoners. He reorganized the entire industrial workflow, analyzing machine output, tracking labor shifts, and calculating the exact friction loss of heavy coin presses. Under Newton's tyrannical supervision, production skyrocketed. The mint went from producing a trickle of coin to turning out over 100,000 pounds in pristine new silver currency every week. Newton did not merely supervise the machinery. He personally audited every account book, eliminating internal corruption, firing incompetent clerks, and restoring international confidence in the British pound. The most dangerous threat to Newton's recoinage was not bad machinery. It was a brilliant, charismatic criminal named William Chaloner. Chaloner was London's undisputed king of counterfeiters. A master metalsmith and confidence man, he had grown rich printing fake banknotes and minting near-perfect fake silver coins. Chaloner was so arrogant that he even appeared before Parliament, publicly accusing Newton and the Royal Mint of incompetence and offering, for a large fee, to take over currency security himself. Newton was outraged. He viewed Chaloner not merely as a thief, but as a traitor, committing high treason against the crown. Newton personally took charge of the investigation. He hired a network of underworld spies, bribed informants in grimy London taverns, and visited filthy dungeons like Newgate Prison to personally interrogate imprisoned criminals, offering them reduced sentences in exchange for testimony against Chaloner. For 2 years, Newton conducted a relentless game of cat and mouse. When Chaloner bribed witnesses to escape initial charges, Newton patiently built an ironclad case, collecting dozens of sworn depositions and tracking down Chaloner's secret printing presses in the London slums. In 1699, Newton struck. Chaloner was arrested, dragged into court, and confronted with an overwhelming mountain of evidence assembled by the world's greatest mathematician. Convicted of high treason, William Chaloner was sentenced to death and hanged at Tyburn in March 1699. Newton watched his most formidable criminal rival meet his end, having proven that the intellect that decoded universal gravitation could just as easily crush the London underworld. In Christmas 1699, following the death of the Mint's master, Newton was officially promoted to Master of the Mint, a position he held for the rest of his life. The promotion made Newton an exceptionally wealthy man, earning a percentage commission on every coin produced by the realm. He moved into a luxurious home in Jermyn Street, Westminster, surrounded himself with fine art and silver plate, and took in his brilliant, attractive niece, Catherine Barton, to serve as his hostess. The reclusive Cambridge scholar had transformed into one of the most powerful, influential figures in the British Empire. In March 1703, Newton's fiercest rival, Robert Hooke, died. For decades, Hooke had been a thorn in Newton's side, disputing his theories on optics and gravity. With Hooke out of the way, Newton immediately re-emerged into public scientific life. Later that year, Newton was elected president of the Royal Society of London, a position he would hold continuously for 24 years until his death. Newton transformed the Royal Society from a relaxed, underfunded social club for gentlemen philosophers into a formidable, disciplined powerhouse of research. He moved the society to new quarters in Crane Court, personally financed equipment, and presided over weekly meetings with absolute authority. It was during his presidency that legend says the only known portrait of Robert Hooke mysteriously disappeared from the Royal Society's walls, a loss many historians suspect Newton orchestrated out of lingering spite. In 1704, with Hooke dead, Newton finally published his long-delayed masterwork on light, Optics. Written in clear English rather than Latin, Optics detailed his prism experiments, theories of color, and particle theory of light, cementing his reputation across the English-speaking world. In April 1705, Queen Anne visited Trinity College, Cambridge, and conferred a knighthood upon Newton. He became Sir Isaac Newton, the first scientist in English history to be knighted for his intellectual achievements. Yet, even at the height of his fame, Newton was consumed by a toxic, ruinous feud over intellectual priority. Decades earlier, during his Year of Wonders at Woolsthorpe in 1666, Newton had invented his method of fluxions, calculus, but true to his secretive nature, he had kept his notes private. In the late 1670s, the brilliant German polymath Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz independently developed his own system of calculus. Unlike Newton, Leibniz published his work promptly in 1684, complete with an elegant notation system. It was far easier to use than Newton's complex fluxions, the very notation system still used in mathematics today. When English mathematicians realized that continental scholars were using Leibniz's calculus, they accused Leibniz of plagiarizing Newton's unpublished papers. Leibniz fiercely denied the charge, appealing directly to the Royal Society to set up an impartial committee to investigate the dispute. Leibniz made a fatal mistake. He forgot that Sir Isaac Newton was the president of the Royal Society. Instead of appointing an independent panel, Newton secretly packed the committee with his staunch supporters. He personally drafted the committee's official report, the Commercium Epistolicum of 1712, and published it anonymously under the Society's name. The report branded Leibniz a thief and a plagiarist who had stolen Newton's ideas from letters sent decades earlier. To compound the insult, Newton even wrote anonymous, glowing reviews of his own report in scientific journals, praising himself while tearing down Leibniz's character. The dispute shattered the European scientific community into two hostile camps. British mathematicians stuck fiercely to Newton's clunky fluxions, while European scholars embraced Leibniz's superior notation. This nationalist divide isolated British mathematics for over a century. Leibniz died in 1716, broken and disgraced. Far from showing remorse, Newton reportedly bragged to friends in his later years that he had broken Leibniz's heart. In the final decade of his life, Sir Isaac Newton was treated less like a scholar and more like a living monument. He resided in an elegant townhome near Leicester Fields in London, cared for by his niece, Catherine Barton. Foreign dignitaries, philosophers, and travelers visiting England sought audiences with the legendary thinker. Visitors described an elderly man with a full head of untamed silver hair, sharp dark eyes, and a calm, quiet voice that commanded immediate authority. Even in his 70s, Newton remained active as Master of the Mint and President of the Royal Society. He spent his leisure hours editing updated editions of his masterworks, the Principia and Optics, while continuing his lifelong obsession with biblical chronology. revising ancient timelines to align historically with Scripture. Though he had amassed immense wealth, leaving behind an estate worth roughly £30,000 equivalent to millions today, he cared little for luxury. He spent sparsely on himself, often giving away large sums to extended family members, universities, and charities. By 1725, Newton's health began to decline. Decades of heavy chemical exposure, combined with advanced age, resulted in severe bouts of gout, kidney stones, and inflammation. He resigned his active duties at the Mint, moving away from London's smoggy air to the quieter village of Kensington. In early March 1727, Newton traveled to London, one last time to preside over a meeting of the Royal Society. The journey drained his remaining strength. Upon returning to Kensington, he suffered severe abdominal pain and lapsed into periods of consciousness and delirium. On March 20, 1727, at 84 years old, Sir Isaac Newton passed away peacefully in his sleep. Following his death, a post-mortem inspection revealed high traces of mercury in his system, a silent witness to the countless hours he had spent over his private alchemy furnace decades earlier. England gave its greatest thinker a farewell fit for royalty. Newton's body lay in state in the Jerusalem chamber of Westminster Abbey. On March 28, 1727, his coffin was carried into the nave of the abbey by high-ranking noblemen, including the Lord High Chancellor and several dukes. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, the first scientist ever granted such an honor, surrounded by the tombs of monarchs, generals, and poets. Above his final resting place, a magnificent marble monument was erected, carved with symbols of his telescopes, prisms, and mathematical charts. The French philosopher Voltaire, who attended the funeral service in London, wrote in amazement to his peers in Paris, "I have seen a professor of mathematics buried like a king who had done well by his subjects." Looking back on his extraordinary journey from an abandoned farm boy to the ruler of European science, Newton offered a famous, humbling perspective on his own achievements shortly before his death. "I do not know what I may appear to the world, but to myself I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore, and diverting myself in now and then finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me." Newton did not merely explain specific phenomena. He gave humanity a new way to understand reality. By combining rigorous mathematics with systematic physical observation, he laid down the blueprint for modern empirical science. When Albert Einstein introduced his theory of general relativity nearly 2 centuries later, expanding our understanding of gravity in high-energy realms, he kept a portrait of Newton on his study wall. Einstein knew that modern physics was not a rejection of Newtonian thought, but a continuation of the foundation Newton had constructed. Sir Isaac Newton lived in solitude, guarded his secrets with fierce paranoia, and fought bitter battles with his peers. Yet, in seeking to understand the mind of God through nature, he broke through the darkness of antiquity and handed humanity the keys to the modern world.